Welcome back for another deep dive. Ready to explore some canyons today?
Always up for an adventure.
Awesome. We've got this chapter from a book all about outdoor recreation, and it focuses on canyons, those landscapes carved by, well, time and water.
Time and water, that's a great way to put it.
Right. So we'll be looking at how people actually experience these natural wonders. And get this, we're going global.
Global canyons. I'm intrigued.
Me too. Plus, we always like to look at the impact, the environmental side of things.
Of course, that's what makes these deep dives so interesting.
Exactly. And I have a feeling some of the research might challenge what we think we know about canyons. Like, are they really as fragile as we think?
Yeah, good point. I mean, we picture canyons as these rugged, rocky places.
Right. But this chapter takes us to the UK, where canyons are actually like havens for plant life. Surprising, right?
Very different image than, say, the Grand Canyon. Okay, I'm ready to learn about UK canyons.
Let's dive in. They call them gorges over there, and the chapter describes them as these hidden pockets of biodiversity.
Hidden pockets, I like that.
Tucked away in the mountains like slices of ancient ecosystems, protected from grazing animals and all that because of the steep sides.
Makes sense. So what kind of plants are we talking about here?
Well, get this. It's a real mix. You've got species you'd normally find near the coast, thriving right alongside alpine plants. It's like a botanical melting pot.
Wow, that's incredible. A real mix of environments.
The chapter even specifically mentions sea plantain.
Sea plantain, the stuff you usually see along the coast.
That's the one. Apparently, it thrives high up in these sheltered gorges. And there's even a rare moss. It's called scarce turf moss.
Scarce turf moss, catchy name.
Right, and it's only found in a handful of Welsh valleys. Pretty cool, huh?
Super cool. But I have a feeling there's a but coming.
You know me too well. There is a but. Here's the thing. This delicate balance is being threatened.
Threatened? By what?
Well, by the very thing that draws people to these places. Gorge walking.
I wouldn't think walking would cause that much damage.
Right. It seems pretty low impact. But think about it. All those people navigating the gorges, it can add up.
I see what you mean, like paths getting worn in, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Paths worn into the delicate turf, moss getting rubbed away, even trees getting damaged. All those seemingly small things over and over again.
Yeah, I get it. So what can be done about it?
Well, that's the big question, right? The chapter talks about some potential solutions, like designating some gorges specifically for recreation.
Okay, so kind of like a zoning system.
Right, and then strictly protecting others. They've also talked about, educating people.
Education, always a good idea.
Yeah, and creating, codes of conduct for gorge walking.
I can see how that would help.
To try and, minimize impact. It's that classic dilemma, though, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Letting people experience these amazing places, but also preserving them.
Exactly. And it seems like this is an issue everywhere, not just in the UK.
Well, let's see what the chapter says about other places then.
Perfect. Next stop, Australia. We're heading to the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area.
The Blue Mountains, now that's a place I've always wanted to see.
It's incredible, over 400 canyons. It's a super popular spot for canyoning.
Canyoning, that sounds adventurous. I bet that has some impact, though.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
All the ropes and gear involved. But park managers initially thought, canyoning must be having a negative impact.
It's an easy assumption to make.
It is. But then this researcher, Dr. Nicole Hardiman, she decided to really investigate the impact.
Oh, interesting. What did she find?
Well, first of all, canyoning wasn't as widespread as they thought. It was mainly in a few specific areas.
Okay, so not as much impact as they initially thought.
Right. And get this. Her research showed no significant impact on the overall water quality.
Oh, wait.
Or on the macroinvertebrates.
Macroinvertebrates. Remind me what those are again.
Tiny critters that live in the streams. Super important for, the health of the ecosystem.
Right. So these little guys were doing just fine.
They were. Even in canyons that saw a lot of canyoning traffic. She even looked at crayfish.
Crayfish.
They're known to be pretty sensitive to disturbances, so she used them as a sort of rapid bioindicator.
Clever.
And even the crayfish seemed unfazed by the canyoners.
So maybe canyoning isn't as bad as we thought.
Well, we have to remember, this research was specific to the Blue Mountains.
True.
What's true in one place might not be true in another.
Makes sense.
But it does show us how important research is.
Oh, yeah, to really understand the impact.
Exactly. We can't just rely on assumptions.
Totally agree. Now I'm even more curious about what the chapter says about the U.S. Southwest.
Me too. Now we're talking iconic landscapes. Zion arches the Grand Canyon.
Now that's what I picture when I think of canyons.
Right. So You can imagine with the popularity of those places, there must be a lot of pressure from canyoneering.
Yeah, for sure.
The chapter actually talks about how canyoneering has exploded in popularity recently.
Social media, right? Everyone sees those amazing photos.
Exactly. And guidebooks, too. More people can access these adventures. But with more people comes more debate.
Oh, debate about what?
About the best practices for protecting these environments. Like what's okay and what's not okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what are the main points of contention?
One of the biggest is all about the use of anchors.
Anchors. For rappelling.
Exactly. There are fixed anchors, which are basically bolts drilled into the rock.
I could see how that could be controversial.
Right. Some argue that it impacts the natural beauty.
Yeah, like a little piece of human infrastructure in the middle of wilderness.
Exactly. So then there are clean anchors, which is usually made of like removable webbing slings.
Ah, so those would leave no trace behind.
Right. But they can be less secure.
Especially for, less experienced canyoneer.
That's the thought.
Yeah.
So it's a safety consideration, too.
Wow. So it's not as simple as just saying one type of anchor is better.
Not at all. The chapter gives some examples of how this is playing out in national parks.
Okay, like where?
Well, in Grand Canyon National Park, there was a big issue at Garden Creek.
Garden Creek. What happened there?
Too many bolts. There was this whole proliferation of them.
I see. So what did they do?
The American Canyoneering Association actually stepped in and organized a restoration effort.
Oh, they removed the bolts.
A lot of them, yeah, to minimize the visual impact.
That's pretty impressive. It shows how seriously they take this.
Definitely. But it also shows how, even within the canyoneering community, there are differing opinions.
Of course.
Some people are all about leave no trace. Others say sometimes fixed anchors might actually be better for the environment.
Wait, really? How so?
The thinking is, if less experienced people don't have that fixed anchor, they might create multiple, less secure ones.
Ah, I see. And that could end up doing more damage overall.
Exactly.
It's complicated.
It is, and it gets even more complex because different national parks have different policies.
That's right. What's allowed in one might be totally prohibited in another.
Oh, man, that must be confusing for canyoneers. Totally. So the question is, how do these parks manage all of this? How do they find that balance?
It sounds like a real challenge.
It is. And that's what we'll look at next. The chapter talks about how different parks are trying different things, like experimenting with different strategies.
Like what?
Well, some parks, like Zion, they're using a lottery system.
A lottery? For what?
To control how many people can enter certain canyons, like the subway.
Ah, so it's like limiting the number of visitors.
Exactly, to protect those more sensitive areas.
That makes sense.
And it kind of reminds me of that idea we talked about earlier, the sacrificial gorge concept in the UK.
Oh, yeah, right. Where some areas are open to the public, but others are strictly off limits.
It's fascinating how similar the challenges are, even in such different parts of the world.
Totally. It's like a global balancing act, trying to find that sweet spot between access and preservation.
Exactly. So besides the lottery system, the chapter also mentioned that some parks are using group size limits.
Group size limits, that seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's like you can only go in with a certain number of people.
So less overall impact from too many feet trampling around.
Right. And some parks are even getting specific about the gear that can be used.
Gear restrictions.
Yeah, like Arches National Park, they prohibit dead man anchors.
Dead man anchors, what are those?
Basically, objects that are buried in the rock to create an anchor point.
Ah, so those could cause damage to the rock itself.
Exactly. Especially when you think about how many people might be using them over time.
Yeah, it's all about minimizing those little impacts, right?
Exactly. And speaking of minimizing impact, guess what else keeps coming up?
Let me guess. Education.
Bingo. The chapter really emphasizes how important it is for canyoneers to be properly trained.
Makes sense. You can have all the rules in the world, but if people don't understand why they're important.
Exactly. It's not enough to just tell people what to do. They need to understand how their actions, even those that seem small, can affect the environment.
So it's about fostering that sense of personal responsibility.
Absolutely. It's realizing that we're all part of a bigger picture, a community of people who care about these places.
It's about recognizing that we're all stewards of these landscapes, whether we're experienced canyoneers or just casual hikers.
Exactly. We've covered so much ground today, from plant life in UK gorges to anchors in the US. It's amazing how much information is packed into this one chapter. What's standing out to you?
For me, It's how much we don't know. It's like we make these assumptions about what's harmful and what's not, but the research often tells a different story.
Yeah, like that Australia study. It's a good reminder that we can't just rely on gut feelings. We need solid data.
Totally. And it's not just about the science, it's about the ethics, too. Like, how much impact are we willing to accept? What are our priorities when it comes to these places?
It always circles back to that tension, right?
Yeah.
Allowing people to experience these amazing landscapes, but also protecting them from overuse. It's a tough balance to strike.
No easy answers. But what I find encouraging is that people are actually trying to find solutions. Like all these different approaches, the research, the education programs, it shows a real commitment to figuring this out.
Like a giant puzzle, isn't it? Trying to piece together all the different factors, the ecology, the recreational use, the cultural significance, and of course, the long-term health of these canyons.
And it's a puzzle that's constantly changing too, like with climate change, for example. That's a whole other layer of complexity.
Right. The chapter did mention that climate change is going to be a major factor moving forward. In fact, I think it said the Grand Canyon National Park is planning to use an adaptive management approach in their new backcountry plan.
Adaptive management. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. It basically means they're going to be constantly monitoring things, gathering data on the impacts of canyoneering, and using that information to adjust the plan as needed.
So it's not just set it and forget it. They're acknowledging that things are constantly changing and they need to be flexible.
Exactly. Which makes sense when you're dealing with something as complex as a canyon ecosystem.
Definitely. It's like a giant experiment, but with incredibly high stakes. These are some of the most stunning landscapes on Earth. We gotta get it right.
Couldn't agree more. So we've talked a lot about organized trips, but what about individual explorers? Do you think the same principles apply?
Absolutely. Even if you're just one person, you're still part of that larger ecosystem.
It's easy to think, oh, it's just me, I'm not making a big impact.
But when you multiply that by the thousands of people who visit these areas, it adds up.
Very true. So individual explorers need to be just as informed, just as responsible.
You could argue they need to be more aware, even because they don't have a guide there to remind them of best practices.
That's a good point. So it all comes down to personal responsibility, right?
Definitely. Educating yourself, choosing gear and techniques that minimize impact, being mindful of your surroundings.
It's about taking ownership of your impact, no matter how small you think it might be.
Exactly. And that's what will ultimately help us protect these places.
One thing that struck me in this chapter was how many different organizations are involved. Like, there are groups focused on education and conservation, search and rescue teams, and even groups that advocate for access to canyons.
It really speaks to the passion people have for these places.
It's like a whole community of people working together to protect and enjoy them responsibly.
And it's not just those organizations, it's the individual adventurers too. Everyone has a role to play.
We started this deep dive talking about the physical impacts of activities like gorge walking and canyoneering. But it feels like the conversation has evolved into something deeper, like our ethical responsibility to these places.
Absolutely. It's not just about following the rules or minimizing our footprint. It's about recognizing that these landscapes have intrinsic value.
And acting in a way that honors that value.
Exactly. It's acknowledging that we're not just visitors passing through. We're part of these ecosystems, even if it's just for a little while. And our actions matter.
Makes you think of that old saying, take only memories, leave only footprints.
Although maybe in this case, we should aim for even lighter footprints, right?
Ah, good. Good one. So much to think about. We've explored canyons all over the world, the ecological impacts, the management challenges. What's the one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with?
Every choice we make, every step we take in these wild places has an impact. It's our responsibility to be aware of that and to do everything we can to make that impact as light as possible, so future generations can enjoy these canyons too.
Beautifully put. And on that note, we'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive into the world of canyons. Back again. We're wrapping up our canyon deep dive, and man, I feel like I've learned a ton.
It's been pretty fascinating, hasn't it? We've covered so much ground, from those hidden gorges in the UK all the way to those epic landscapes in the American Southwest. And of course, we've really dug into that balance between, letting people enjoy these places and protecting them.
Thinking about everything we've talked about, like the erosion and those anchor debates, one thing keeps popping into my head. We talked about how we impact canyons, but what about the impact on canyons themselves from, climate change?
That is a great question, and honestly, it's one that doesn't get enough attention. Climate change is already having a real impact on canyons, and I think we're only going to see those impacts become more more noticeable in the years to come.
I mean, it makes sense, right? With rising temperatures and changes in rainfall, those are bound to have some effects.
For sure, and not to mention those more frequent intense storms. All of that can really disrupt those delicate ecosystems in canyons. Remember those UK gorges with their little microclimates and those rare plants? Imagine what happens if those rainfall patterns shift or if the temperatures get too high.
It's kind of scary, isn't it, how fragile those landscapes really are?
Absolutely. And it's not just the plants either. When the water flow changes, it can change the rivers too, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
More erosion, maybe even flash flooding. And we're already seeing some of that happening, especially in places like the American Southwest.
Yeah, those flash floods are no joke. They can completely reshape a canyon overnight. It's incredible and kind of terrifying.
Definitely. I think it reminds us that while canyons seem so permanent and unchanging, they're really these dynamic systems. They're constantly responding to, well, to everything from natural processes to, of course, what we humans do.
So as we try to be, as low impact as possible, we also need to be thinking about how climate change is affecting these places and what we can do to help.
Exactly. It's like a two-pronged approach, isn't it? Thinking about the local impacts of our activities and the global issue of climate change.
It's a lot to consider.
Ah,
But this deep dive has been a great reminder of how complex those canyon ecosystems really are and how important it is to keep researching, managing responsibly, and, well, just being aware.
it really has been a fascinating journey, from those tiny little mosses all the way to those massive forces of nature.
So to our listener, if you take away just one thing from this whole deep dive, we hope it's this. Canyons are so much more than just pretty landscapes. They're these vibrant ecosystems that are super vulnerable to our actions and to the changing climate. It's up to all of us to be informed and to be responsible.
And the good news is we can do something about it. There are those organizations working to protect canyons, working on climate change. We can support them. We can advocate for, good policies, and we can keep learning and sharing what we know.
So next time you're looking up at those canyon walls, think about all of that, the beauty, the complexity, and, yeah, that fragility too. Let's all do our part to make sure those canyons are around for a long, long time.
Beautifully put. They really are more than just rocks and water, aren't they? They're windows into history. They're homes to amazing creatures. They're sources of inspiration. And, well, let's just keep it that way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into canyons. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those questions coming. Until next time, happy adventuring.